$1. That's what the deed cost Thomas Vance when the auctioneer's gavel fell, its sharp crack echoing the snap of his last hope. The crowd in dusty Prosperity, Nevada, offered a few scattered, pitying claps that felt more like mockery. For $1, Thomas now owned the abandoned Jessup Place, 300 acres of sun-baked dirt, a collapsed barn, and a cabin that looked like a strong wind would turn it back into lumber. He felt the weight of the coin in his pocket, a cold, useless circle of metal that had just purchased him a lifetime of back-breaking work with no guarantee of reward. He was a man accustomed to having little, but this felt like a new kind of poverty. The Jessup Place wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed, people said. Old man Jessup had lost his wife to fever, his herd to drought, and finally his mind to solitude. Thomas, with his weathered face and hands calloused from a decade of working other men's ranches, knew he was just one bad season away from the same fate. But the land was his. The single word, his, was a balm on the raw wound of his pride. He spent the first day walking the property line, the summer sun beating down on his worn hat. The fences were a joke, sagging wires and broken posts that wouldn't hold a sleeping cow, let alone a determined one. The creek was bone dry, its cracked bed a pale scar across the brown earth. Yet, as he stood on a small rise overlooking the valley, watching the sun bleed orange and purple across the horizon, a stubborn feeling took root in his chest. It was a ruin, but it was his ruin. He could build it back. He had to. That evening, he sat on the rickety porch of the cabin, eating the last of his bacon and beans from a tin plate. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. This was the solitude that had broken Jessup. Thomas wondered if he was strong enough to bear it. As dusk settled, turning the world to shades of grey and deep blue, he saw movement on the low road that led to the property. At first, he thought it was a stray horse, or maybe a deer. But the shape became clearer, more deliberate. It was a rider on a dark brown horse, moving not with the frantic pace of someone lost, but with the weary exhaustion of someone who had reached the end of their road. Thomas stood up slowly, his hand resting near the worn axe handle he'd been using to test the porch floorboards. Strangers weren't always a threat, but they were never a comfort. The rider drew closer, and the details began to resolve themselves in the fading light. The horse was a fine animal, strong-boned but lathered with sweat and trembling with fatigue. The rider, however, was what made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was a woman. And she was wearing a dress the color of a sunrise, a pale, shimmering pink silk that seemed to glow in the twilight. It was a dress meant for a fine parlor in San Francisco, not the dusty, desolate expanse of the Nevada frontier. As she came to a halt before the cabin, he saw that she was Chinese, her black hair coiled in an intricate knot, her face pale and smudged with dirt, but her back held straight with an unyielding dignity. She slid from the horse, her movements graceful despite her obvious exhaustion, and looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes that held no fear, only a profound and bottomless weariness. She said nothing, simply stood there, a vision of impossible elegance in a world of dirt and decay. Thomas Vance, owner of a $1 ranch, had no idea that his ruin had only just begun. He gestured with the axe toward the water trough by the well. "Horse looks like it could use a drink," it was all he could think to say. The woman watched his hands, not his face, as if trying to read a language she did not speak. She gave a small, sharp nod, and led the horse to the trough, her hands gentle on its reins. Thomas went inside the cabin and returned with a tin cup of water from his own barrel. He held it out to her. She looked at the cup, then at his face, and for a long moment, he thought she would refuse. Then, with a quiet dignity, she took it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cool. She drank the water slowly, deliberately, as if measuring each swallow. When she was done, she handed the cup back, her eyes finally meeting his. She inclined her head in a gesture of thanks. "My name is Thomas," he said, pointing to his chest. She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then, she touched her own chest, her voice a soft murmur that the wind almost carried away. "Lin Mai." The name was as foreign and delicate as her dress. He didn't know what to do. The rules of hospitality were simple out here, but they hadn't accounted for this. He couldn't turn her away, night was falling and the coyotes were already beginning their chorus in the hills. He couldn't invite her into the one-room cabin either, that would be a different kind of trouble. He pointed toward the barn, or what was left of it. The roof had a hole the size of a wagon wheel, but one corner was still sound and dry. "You can stay in there. It's safe." She looked at the dilapidated structure, then back at him. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but assessment. She was judging his character, his intentions. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. She nodded again and led her horse toward the barn. Thomas was left alone on the porch, the empty tin cup still in his hand, feeling as though he had just inherited a second, far more complicated ruin. The next morning, he rose before dawn and found her already awake. She had brushed her horse until its coat shone, and was now standing by the dry creek bed, staring at the cracked earth. Her pink dress was stained with dust at the hem, a line of grime that marked her entry into his world. He started a small fire and put a pot of coffee on to boil. When it was ready, he poured a cup and walked over to her. She accepted it with the same quiet grace as the night before. Using a series of gestures and a few shared words, water, sun, ground, he began to understand. She was showing him how the creek had once flowed, where the water would have pooled. She pointed to the base of the hills, tracing a line in the air, suggesting a path for a diversion ditch. He had been so overwhelmed by the scale of the ranch's decay that he hadn't seen the simple logic of its potential. This woman, who looked as if she'd never held a tool heavier than a teacup, saw it immediately. He had to go to town for supplies, flour, salt, and more importantly, nails and a new axe head. He was reluctant to leave her alone, but necessity gave him no choice. He tried to explain with gestures, pointing toward the town, then at the sack of flour, then back to himself. She seemed to understand, giving him a single, reassuring nod. Prosperity was little more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith. As Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post outside Henderson's Mercantile, he felt the usual weight of the town's gaze. He was the fool who'd bought the Jessup place. Today, however, the stares felt different. They were sharper, laced with a new kind of curiosity and suspicion. Inside the store, Mr. Henderson, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, stopped polishing the counter and watched Thomas approach. "Vance," he said, his tone flat. "Come for more charity." "Just supplies, Henderson." "Put them on my account." "Your account is your good name, and I hear that's taken a hit." Henderson gestured with his chin toward the town notice board. Pinned to the rough wood was a fresh sheet of paper, the ink still dark. Thomas walked over to it. The notice was written in a clean, educated hand. It offered a $50 reward for information leading to the return of a runaway wife. It described her as Chinese, slender, and last seen wearing a fine silk dress of a pinkish hue. It was signed by a Mr. Alastair Sterling of San Francisco. A cold knot formed in Thomas's stomach. $50 was more money than he'd seen in a year. It was enough to buy a good horse, a small herd, a real start. It was enough to tempt anyone in this town. "That man, Sterling, came through yesterday," Henderson said, his voice low. "Riding a fine carriage. Said his wife is flighty. Got confused and wandered off from their camp down by the river. He's putting up at the hotel, waiting for word." Thomas said nothing, his face a careful mask. He gathered his supplies, the weight of them feeling heavier than usual. "A man has a right to his property, Vance," Henderson said as Thomas paid with the last of his cash. "And a wife is property, according to the law. You do well to remember that. Harboring her is the same as stealing." The words followed him out of the store and all the way back to the ranch. He was a thief now, not just a fool. The solitude of the Jessup place had seemed like a burden yesterday. Today, it felt like a sanctuary. But he knew it wouldn't last. A man like Sterling, a man with money and carriages, would not be patient for long. When he rode up to the cabin, he saw Lin Mai near the well. She had taken off the elegant outer layer of her dress, revealing a simpler set of silk trousers and a tunic beneath. She had found a rusty shovel head and was using it to clear the weeds choking the area around the cabin's foundation. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Seeing her work, seeing the quiet determination in her movements, solidified something in him. She was not flighty, she was not confused, she was a woman fighting for something. He didn't know how to tell her about the notice, about the man in town. He didn't have the words. Instead, he took the new axe head from his steel bag and began fitting it to a handle. He worked with a furious energy, splitting logs for firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. Later that afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen, he saw a dust cloud on the road. It was not a single rider. It was a wagon, a light buckboard pulled by 2 horses, and it stopped at the edge of his property, right where the broken fence met the road. A man in a tailored suit and a city hat sat holding the reins, staring at the cabin. He was too far away for Thomas to see his face clearly, but he didn't need to. He knew it was Sterling. The man just sat there for a long time, watching, making his presence known. It was a silent declaration of ownership, a promise of trouble to come. Linmai had seen him too. She had stopped her work and stood very still, her back to the cabin, a small, defiant figure against the vast, empty landscape. The man in the wagon finally turned his horses and drove away, but the threat remained, hanging in the dusty air like heat. That night, a palpable tension settled over the small ranch. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was heavy with unspoken questions and unseen dangers. Thomas sat on the porch step, cleaning a rifle he hadn't used in years, the metallic scrape of the cleaning rod a sharp, repetitive sound in the quiet. He wasn't a man of violence, but Henderson's words echoed in his head. A wife is property. The law was on Sterling's side. Linmai came out of the barn and walked toward the porch. She didn't sit, but stood a few feet away, her arms crossed against the evening chill. The moon was rising, casting long shadows that made the broken-down ranch look even more forlorn. That man, she said, her voice clear and steady, breaking the silence. He will come back. Thomas stopped his work and looked up at her, surprised. Her English was better than he'd realized, more complete. She had been holding it back, saving it. He calls himself your husband, Thomas said, his voice rough. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. He calls me many things. Property. Investment. None of them are true. She took a breath, and then the story came out, not in a rush, but in careful, measured sentences. Her father was a merchant in San Francisco. He had arranged a marriage for her, a partnership with the son of another merchant in Denver, to strengthen their family businesses. Mr. Sterling was an associate, a man trusted to escort her and her dowry across the territory. He was polite, she said, her voice laced with contempt. He spoke of honor and business. But he never meant to take me to Denver. I heard him talking with his driver. They were taking me to a mining camp in the north. To be sold. She looked at Thomas, her eyes dark in the moonlight. My dowry was in gold coin. He took it. He believes he has bought me. Her escape had been desperate. At a ferry crossing on the Carson River, she had waited until Sterling and his man were distracted in a saloon, then simply untied her horse from the carriage and ridden away, heading east, into the empty wilderness, hoping to disappear. She had ridden for 2 days, sleeping little, eating nothing, until she saw the smoke from Thomas's chimney. I am not his wife, she said, the words hitting the air with the force of a final judgment. I am his prisoner. And I will not go back. She reached into a small silk pouch that hung from a cord around her neck. From it, she pulled a small, folded piece of paper, its creases worn soft from handling. She unfolded it and held it out to him. It was a letter, written in elegant Chinese characters, but at the bottom, in clear English script, was an address in San Francisco. The name was Chan, not Sterling. This was her proof. This flimsy piece of paper was all that stood between her and the man who claimed her. Thomas took it, the paper feeling fragile and important in his calloused hands. He was holding her entire history, her one connection to the life that had been stolen from her. He looked from the paper to her face, seeing not a helpless victim, but a woman of incredible strength. She had survived, and she was still fighting. The next morning, they returned. Sterling was not alone this time. He was accompanied by a portly man with a tarnished star pinned to his vest, the territorial deputy from Prosperity. They rode right up to the cabin, their horses trampling the small patch of ground Linmai had cleared. Sterling dismounted, his movement smooth and confident. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and cold, assessing eyes. He ignored Linmai completely, addressing himself only to Thomas. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice calm and reasonable. "I believe you have my wife. I'm here to collect her. We can do this peacefully." "She's not your wife," Thomas said, his voice low. He stood on the porch, positioning himself between Sterling and the cabin door, where Linmai now stood. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of patience. "I have a marriage certificate, filed in Sacramento." "Deputy, if you please." The deputy, looking uncomfortable, produced a document from his bag. It looked official. Thomas knew it was a forgery, but the deputy did not. To him, this was a simple domestic dispute, a runaway wife and a wronged husband. "Vance, the law is clear," the deputy said, his tone apologetic but firm. "You are interfering. This man has a legal claim. You give the woman over, and we'll forget this happened." Thomas felt the trap closing around him. The law, the town, the man with the money, they were all aligned against him. He could save his own skin. He could step aside, let them take her, and go back to his solitary struggle with this cursed land. It was the sensible thing to do. He glanced back at Linmai. She had not flinched. Her chin was high, her gaze fixed on Sterling with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. There was no plea for help in her eyes, only a silent command to stand firm. In that moment, he knew he couldn't give her up. It wasn't about sense. It was about right and wrong, and this was a clearer line as he had ever seen drawn in the dirt. "This is my property," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his decision. "And you are not welcome on it. Get off my land." Sterling's polite mask slipped. A flash of fury crossed his face. "You will regret this, you ignorant farmer. I will have the law tear this place apart to get what is mine." "Then you'd best start," Thomas said. "Because she's not going with you." The deputy shifted his weight, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Don't be a fool, Vance. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." For a long moment, no one moved. The sun beat down, the air thick with tension. It was the word of a penniless cowboy and a foreign woman against a wealthy man with a piece of paper. Thomas knew how this story usually ended. But he did not move. He held his ground. Finally, Sterling gave a sharp, angry laugh. "Fine. Have it your way," he turned to the deputy. "We'll be back. With a warrant and more men." He climbed back into his wagon, his movement stiff with rage. He snapped the reins, and the wagon turned, churning up dust as it sped back down the road toward town. The deputy lingered for a moment, giving Thomas a look that was a mixture of pity and warning, before turning his horse and following. They were alone again. The dust settled, and the silence that returned was different. It was the silence of a battle postponed, not won. Thomas looked at Linmai. He had just risked everything, his freedom, his life, his $1 ranch, for a woman he barely knew. He felt a tremor in his hands and clenched them into fists to still them. He had made his choice. Now, they would have to face the consequences together. 6 months passed. The harsh Nevada winter came and went, burying the land in a brief, clean blanket of snow that melted to feed the thirsty earth. Now, in the full bloom of spring, the Jessup place was unrecognizable. A new fence line, straight and strong, enclosed a pasture where a small herd of 20 cattle grazed on new grass. The dry creek bed now flowed with a steady stream of water, diverted from a mountain spring through a carefully dug irrigation ditch that nourished a sprawling vegetable garden next to the cabin. The cabin itself had a sound roof and a sturdy porch, its wood still pale and new. Inside, the single room was clean and organized. On a small, handmade table, Lin Mai sat with an open ledger, her pen scratching as she tallied the costs of seed against the projected sale price of their first calves. The elegant pink dress was carefully folded and stored in a wooden chest. She now wore practical denim trousers and a simple cotton shirt, clothes of a woman who worked the land. Thomas sat by the fire, mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with familiar, competent motions. The quiet comfort between them was born of shared labor and a shared victory. After the confrontation with Sterling, Thomas had used the last of his money to send 2 telegraphs. The first was to the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City, detailing Sterling's claim and Lin Mai's story. The second, including a transcription of the address on her letter, was to a shipping company agent in San Francisco, with a plea to deliver a message to a Mr. Chan. For 2 weeks, they had lived on a knife's edge, watching the road, expecting the return of the deputy and his men. They worked from sunup to sundown, fortifying the ranch as if preparing for a siege. Then, one afternoon, a lone rider approached. It was not the deputy, but a U.S. Marshal, a grim, quiet man who asked questions for 2 hours and listened intently to Lin Mai's account. He examined the forged marriage certificate Thomas had insisted the deputy leave behind. The marshal left as quietly as he had arrived, and a week later they received word from town. Alastair Sterling had been arrested. He was wanted in California on charges of fraud and theft. His entire story was a lie. A month after that, a letter arrived, followed by a bank draft. It was from Lin Mai's father. He was overjoyed to hear she was safe and horrified by Sterling's betrayal. The money he sent was not a dowry, but an investment, he had written. An investment in his daughter's future, and in the honorable man who had protected her. That money had bought their cattle, their supplies, their beginning. Thomas finished his repair and hung the bridle on a peg by the door. He looked at Lin Mai, her head bent over the ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had managed their finances with a skill that baffled him, turning his $1 purchase into a thriving enterprise. She had shown him how to read the land, while he had shown her how to mend a fence. They were partners in every sense of the word. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and a small smile touched her lips. "The numbers are good, Thomas. We will make a profit this year." "We made a profit the day you rode in," he said simply. His eyes drifted to the cabin wall. There, hanging in a simple frame he had made from scrap wood, was the original deed to the ranch. It was creased and faded, the auctioneer's signature a messy scrawl. $1. It had seemed like the price of a ruin. But he knew now that a home was not the land you bought for $1. It was the person you chose to stand with on it, no matter the cost. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.